We'll start about the article about the Israeli 4 tribes. Alex Mintz, Chairman, Inclusive Israeli Society Initiative, Lauder School of Government, and from the IDC, Herzliya. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Can you just put the presentation up? Dear friends who are sitting on the steps, you can go in. There are a few seats left in the hall. Let me start. And we're talking about joint Israeliness, or are we talking about tribes? There were quantitative indices by various people in the Herzliya IDC. The research was to answer the question whether Israel is now going towards joint Israelism, so to speak, or whether there are 4 tribes, each pulling its own direction. So if we're talking about the expansion or the reduction of gaps, the tribes of the Israeli society, the president, when he spoke in Herzliya 2 years ago, he talked about these 4 tribes. But this is not the only division. But I think we can divide it into 6. Professor Rubinstein, in his new book about Israeli tribes, he says about 12 tribes. And then Professor Sachis Samocha has other numbers. So you can divide the Israeli society in various ways. But we decided to start according to the presidents. And we continue with this issue of 4 tribes. And we developed indices of comparisons between the tribes, and because we talk about the development in Israel, we're talking about education, employment, infrastructure, and political and social stance. And we, of course, we were held by the Statistics Bureau and the Ministry of Education. We chose 20 mayors, 20 cities that are divided into these. The parameters that we took were in education, how many children in every class, how many go to the matrics, and then in employment, the rate of people employed in the cities, and of course the average wages, infrastructure, resources, the participation of the government in the income of the municipality, and then the average income of the residents. And then we talked about political and social positions, political affiliations, and the stance of those tribes regarding Judea and Samaria. What about the joint Israeli feeling? And of course, all the other aspects. We would like to show you all the data while comparing regarding each city. There are a few places here, so we'll start with allocation per students in shekels per year. From the highest, where we see the allocation is higher in the development towns and the lower in the cities. Here we talk about people and students who get the matriculation. Again, the higher is in affluent cities, and the lower is in cities that are more poor. And what we see is that the allocation and the lower ones are usually in the ultra-Orthodox, in the Arab. It doesn't come even to a half of the allocation per students among the secular or the other tribes. And also we see great gaps. Also regarding the matriculation exams, in the secular and the national religious sectors, it's much higher than those in the Arab sector and also in the ultra-Orthodox. If we look at the number of students in a class and we make a comparison, then the positive trend of less children in a classroom is, again, in all the tribes, but in the Arab sector it's still less. We have huge gaps between the secular and the national religious tribes and the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, meaning investment in education. And we see also that there's a difference in students getting the matriculation exams. And the significance is that there are gaps that are growing. The number of people employed within the age groups of working ages, we see places that it's high and others that are low. If we talk about the average wages, again, if you take each tribe separately, you see a picture that shows an improvement in the number of employed among the Arab sector. But if you compare it again to all the other 4 tribes, then you see that the gaps between secular and religious and the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox are still expanding. Nevertheless, so it's true that among the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, people work more today. There are more job placements, but the average salary for people among these tribes is higher, 60% higher among the secular and national religious than the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox. Here it's the general expenditures of the municipality per resident. We see that in the affluent municipalities, we see it's 3 times more than a municipality in the ultra-Orthodox or the Arabs. In the secular municipalities, because of the matching system, then these gaps are much higher. And you don't see it maybe in the data, but the participation of the government in income to the municipality, it's the same pattern. It's a moderate rise, the participation of the government in all the tribes, but in the religious, the ultra-Orthodox, it's more than double the participation of the government in those municipalities. Here we see the expenditure on the development of infrastructure, and we see again that there's a difference between those tribes. I don't want to elaborate. And now I want to tie it to the typification of the tribes according to the political point of view. This is a survey that shows that 85% of the national religious said they were right. The secular tribe is maybe this, they're separated, and maybe that's their power. They have left, they have right, they have center, and that's what we know about it. As for the religious level, that actually shows you the pattern of voting in Israel. And this also is reflected in the position regarding the end of the occupation in Judea and Samaria. We see that the Arabs and the secular are in favor, the religious are against. Altogether, the political right supports our remaining in Judea and Samaria, while the center and the left support the 2-state solution. Let's take a look at this slide. It gives you the position of the tribes regarding equality, rights, and obligations. We see 15, 16% or 8% of people who believe that there is equality among the tribes, both rights and obligations, but apparently the Arabs and the secular shade that there is a need to reduce the equality. Maybe the Arabs, it's because where they come from in this hierarchy. Same goes to change the situation between rights and obligations. Most of the people doesn't think that in Israel there's equality of rights or duties. Most of the Arab tribes, they do support to condition getting rights by allocating resources by obligations. And this is maybe one of the interesting insights that 50% of the Arab tribes would like to integrate in the state of Israel, which is quite surprising. Also to have more education systems, and that's quite salient. The lack of equality in investments in education, in infrastructure can, of course, deepen the gaps. And it shows the allocation of 15 billion shekels to the Arab tribe, but now the implementation of that doesn't happen really. It takes too long. Also regarding investment in education, in infrastructure, it's more in the national religious and the secular tribes rather than in the others. So the main finding, first of all, the data the last decade show a hierarchy among those tribes. The national religious tribe is the one that benefits most from the economy, the infrastructure, the education in Israel in most parameters, in allocations for education, for infrastructure, for schooling. The secular tribe is in the second place in most of the parameters. The ultra-Orthodox, the third place. The Arab is much way back in arrears in almost all the parameters. And all the municipalities that are in the Judea and Samaria, they're there in the Judea and Samaria area. And let me conclude with a few main insights of our research. In the last decade, there was no real advancement towards any joint Israeli feature. It's exactly the contrary. We are detaching from one another. Sami Samocha spoke about the chaos in the periphery. There are all sorts of rifts in Israeli society, and we were hoping that it's going to reduce. But among those tribes, apparently it's exactly the opposite. And if this trend continues, then the vision of the president of the state 2 years ago is going to be just a dream. If we look at it from a tribal point of view, we see that every tribe in itself does have some improvement. But if you compare them, we see a grim picture. Much more grim than it was in the past because of those deepening gaps. Israel is marching ahead, but the gaps among those tribes are expanding, and it's getting worse. So Israel is advancing, but again, the gaps are expanding, and the bottom line is that the research actually looked whether Israel is going towards a joint Israeli common feature or different and separate tribes. We see that if these trends continue, then not only are we not going to have the vision of the Prime Minister, but we're going to detach ourselves. The national strength of Israel, this is the main topic of this conference, to start having more equality and solidarity in society. But in order to promote this joint Israeli feeling, we need a drastic change in the policy, and that can only come from the government. Thank you.